One of the popular homeschool programs among Catholic families that's been around since, I guess, the 1990s. Laura Berquist, who founded this program, wrote a book called How to Design Your Own Classical Curriculum, or something like that, I think. It was written right after Doug Wilson had published his book, Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. I talked about this in an article I wrote about how Laura Berquist misled thousands of Catholic families by presenting something that really is of Protestant origin as a renewal of classical Catholic education. But Mother of Divine Grace School developed um, at that time. And what I'd like to do is just walk through the Mother of Divine Grace website and take a look at the curriculum and analyze that curriculum and ask the question simply, is this a classical Catholic curriculum? Let's just look at this objectively. I'm not, obviously I'm biased in the sense that I'm working to restore a true classical Catholic curriculum. But Mother of Divine Grace School makes the claim that this is classical Catholic education. And let's just take a look at that and see, what are the sources? What are the justifications for this curriculum? How does this curriculum actually work? How is it organized? What are its sources? And so on. And then let's also look at some things like cost and sustainability, and whether this program makes sense in light of current communication and educational technology. So let's just walk through this website. Let's start here right up top with the curriculum page. I'm just going to click on this curriculum link and let's look at curriculum at a glance. So let's just walk through this curriculum together and take a look. Mother of Divine Grace's curriculum is a particular application of Laura Berquist's recommendations in her book, Designing Your Own Classical Curriculum, as I mentioned. Now notice, designing your own classical curriculum. And the first question we have to ask is, what does it mean, your own classical curriculum? Is there a classical curriculum, or is there not a classical curriculum? What would it mean for some random homeschool parent to design their own classical curriculum? Either there is a classical curriculum and we're doing that, or there's not, and we're just designing our own curriculum, period. But that's the book that I referred to before, Designing Your Own Classical Curriculum. It says here explicitly that it is based on the classical method. And again, we have to ask the question, what is the classical method? Now, if there is, in fact, a classical method, then we'd have to ask, where in history was this method actually employed? And I'll argue that there is no such thing. Well, there is a classical method, and it was employed all through ancient and classical and medieval history in developing degrees. It was clarified and perfected ultimately by Thomas Aquinas and the scholastics of the 13th century, and then sort of renewed by the Jesuits in the 16th and 17th centuries. But what we have here in this Mother of Divine Grace program, we have to ask, the method of this program, is this program anything that can be found in history? And if not, how can it be claimed or told to parents that it is based on the classical method? So let's look at the claims and hold this program accountable to these claims. We're told that the Mother of Divine Grace curriculum is based on the classical method. which aims at establishes the tools of learning. And this is a key phrase because the tools of learning comes from Dorothy Sayers' speech, which was titled "The Lost Tools of Learning." So we see the actual source. The actual source of the ideas behind this curriculum are not any ideas of the ancient philosophers or the medieval Catholic schoolmasters and philosophers, the Jesuit schoolmasters, or anyone else in history. This program is based on the ideas that were shared by Dorothy Sayers in her speech titled The Lost Tools of Learning, which was the basis of the Protestant pastor Doug Wilson's book, Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning, which is actually, I'll argue, the foundation of this homeschool program. Now, we read, to learn more about the methodology implemented in the school's curriculum, we can look at the methodology page. We'll look at that in a minute. On the overview of the curriculum page, we give a more detailed explanation of the program with links to articles and so on. Here are the various grade levels. Now, here's where we get to our first ability to observe this. What we see is we have the K to 12 school model here. Now, the K to 12 school model never existed until the 1850s. It was invented by and for public schools, and therefore this model, the K to 12 model, has nothing to do with classical Catholic education through history. This is modern education. And these terms, these names, grammatical stage, dialectic stage, and rhetorical stage, again, have nothing to do with the history or philosophy of classical education. These terms come from Dorothy Sayers' essay or speech, The Lost Tools of Learning. These are not coming from classical Catholic educational history. These are coming from Dorothy Sayers' essay, which is where we get this phrase, the tools of learning. So we have a K to 12 educational program with these names taken from the actual classical trivium and simply used as labels for the three normal divisions of elementary, middle, and high school. So we have a rebranding of these names, as it were, which is confusing and deceptive because it makes us think that we're restoring something when we're actually not restoring that thing. Grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric were not stages of learning. They're three separate arts. They're three separate arts. Grammar is learned in a grammar textbook like Alvarez's Latin grammar. Dialectic, which isn't even the right name for the subject, it should just be reasoning, is studied through Aristotle's Organon. And then lastly, rhetoric is studied in Aristotle's Rhetoric or in the writings of Cicero. So this whole system is taken from modern education and is rebranded with these labels taken from Dorothy Sayers' speech, The Lost Tools of Learning. Now, right here, we have another assertion. Our curriculum is Catholic and classical. Our curriculum is Catholic and classical. This doesn't say that this program is our own invention that we simply think is a good idea. Parents are told explicitly that this curriculum is Catholic and classical. Now, what does that mean? If you're a parent reading this page, what does that mean? Doesn't that suggest to you that if you were to go back and look at the educational work of the saints throughout Catholic history, or to look back to the classical philosophers, that what is taught here in this homeschool program is what was taught there in Catholic and classical history? If that's not what this means, then what does this mean? Our curriculum is Catholic and classical. Would the doctors of the Catholic Church recommend this program? Would the classical philosophers recommend this program? Will we ever see this program in the history of Christian education? That's an assertion that I would say is false. This program is not Catholic historically, and it's certainly not classical historically. Again, the K-12 system didn't even exist until it was invented by public schools, which were invented in the late 1800s. It goes on to say, we have been careful to select the best sources available in all subject areas. Now, again, that's an assertion made to homeschool parents who are going to trust that educational professionals who have access to all of the resources available are in fact selecting the best sources in all subject areas. So when we look at the books and the study materials of Mother of Divine Grace School, are these really the best sources available? If so, is there any support from, let's say, saints or doctors of the church or philosophers that these are, in fact, the best sources for these studies? Because let's be honest, with Google Books and with archive.org and all of the digital resources available to us, we have access to all the sources from history. So are these really the best sources available in all subject areas? This is clearly going to be seen to be a false assertion. All the books we recommend fit the classical methodology. And we'll look at this in a minute, but I'm going to contend that if this is a methodology that is classical, is this a methodology that we will actually find in practice in Catholic educational history? And if not, what does this phrase even mean? The classical methodology. I'll argue that this is another false and misleading assertion. It goes on to say, the books we have selected for middle school help students analyze what they read. The books we have selected for high school help develop skills in discussing reasonably and writing persuasively. So what they mean by best books is books that fit this artificial K-12 Dorothy Sayers 3 stages of learning model. That's what they mean by this term, best sources. But again, this has nothing to do with Catholic or classical educational history. This is a modern theory that serves a modern system of education based on modern secular public school standards. I want parents to see that these claims made by this program are not supportable. There is no Catholic schoolmaster in history who ever used the sources or the structure of this program in the education of children, ever. And there's certainly no one in classical history that ever did so either. It goes on to say, our curricular materials have been examined to ensure that they are not opposed to the Catholic faith. While not every text in the program is explicitly Catholic, that is, they're not Catholic, we avoid materials which are opposed explicitly or implicitly to the truths of the faith. Okay, so this is a Catholic curriculum, and yet the sources are not necessarily Catholic. They are simply books that are judged to not explicitly or implicitly deny the Catholic faith. So that's another question. Are there no Catholic sources for these studies? If these subjects were studied all through church history, for example, if the Jesuits studied and taught these subjects? Why are we using curriculum materials that are not necessarily Catholic? Why don't we use those study materials? Why don't we use the study materials that are explicitly Catholic? Something's wrong here. This can't be true. This can't be necessary that we use non-Catholic textbooks when the curriculum is claimed to have been used throughout history. Why would we not be able to use Catholic textbooks? It doesn't make any sense for a parent who's thinking critically as they read through this. And then there's a quote from St. Augustine here. And you'll see that this quote is taken from On Christian Doctrine. Now, this is misleading. Again, the quote is used to say that anything that has truth in it can be claimed by Christians as their own. That seems to make sense, and it seems to support their idea here, and it justifies why they're using non-Catholic textbooks while claiming to offer a Catholic education. But here's the problem with this quote. In this book on Christian doctrine, St. Augustine actually explains the real classical Catholic curriculum that is not practiced and used in the Mother of Divine Grace curriculum. So while this quote, taken out of context, can be used to justify using any book that doesn't explicitly contradict the Catholic faith, what Augustine is referring to here is actually the continued study of classical philosophy by the Catholic Church. So the reason why we continue to study Aristotle is because his philosophical teaching is true. The reason why we continue to study Plato and Euclid and Pythagoras is because they're teaching on these different subjects, even though they themselves are not Christians because they couldn't be, because they died before the Christian era. It's okay for us to bring their teachings into the Christian church because they contain the truth. Notice the significant point. These men, these wise men, existed before the church was founded, and the church continued to study their writings. We're not talking about books that are published in the 1990s and are not Catholic being used in a Catholic curriculum. That's not what St. Augustine's talking about. He's talking about the fact that, as in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we study the writings of non-Christian, pre-Christian classical philosophers because their teachings are true. He's not justifying using non-Catholic textbooks in what you call a Catholic curriculum. So this quote doesn't support what Mother of Divine Grace is doing and explaining in this paragraph. Let's go on. Guided by this principle, which again is a quote taken out of context, we include materials that do not come from Catholic sources. It says now here's more misleading statements. We prefer, whenever possible, to support Catholic authors and Catholic publishers and bookstores. Now, when we consider that all of the textbooks and study materials needed for a classical Catholic education are available from Catholic authors, it's not possible, it's not true to say that we prefer, whenever possible, to support those authors when we don't use their books but use others instead. That's simply not true. We also know that some people do not wish to use materials from non-Catholic sources. Well, that's obvious. If we're giving our children an education that was given to Catholics through history, why in the world are we using non-Catholic sources unless, as I said, they're pre-Christian sources that were preserved as authoritative philosophical texts? This does not justify using new books from non-Catholic sources, that makes no sense. Parents should desire that their children not study from non-Catholic sources, especially new books that have been printed. So we have these claims. Again, this is very misleading. If parents are not critical, I don't think that they pick up on all of these things, and that's why I want to walk through this curriculum with a review. My criticisms again are this idea of designing your own classical curriculum is sketchy at best. Claiming that this is based on a classical method with no evidence that that's true and no connection to the history of Catholic education is another questionable claim at best, if not explicitly false, which I would argue that this is. Basing this education on The Lost Tools of Learning, a speech by Dorothy Sayers, which is relatively insignificant and completely disconnected from Catholic educational history, is another red flag. Trying to justify why the curriculum doesn't even include Catholic books is another red flag. Misquoting a statement from St. Augustine in a book where he explains and names the true subjects of a classical Catholic education, and then claiming to desire to support Catholic authors while using new books being published by non-Catholic authors is just not, it's just not true. It's simply not true. If we're giving our children a true classical Catholic education, all of the study materials can either be provided by Catholic authors or pre-Christian authorities in subjects like philosophy and the classical liberal arts. And that's what we do in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. None of these excuses or justifications for using non-Catholic resources. Now, what I'd like to look at here is this methodology page, because this has been claimed on a number of different occasions in this page here to be the classical method. So let's take a look at methodology and see what we have here. Now, at the top of the page, we have a big, colorful picture of Aristotle and Plato. And in this picture, we have all of the authors of the works of the classical liberal arts. Here in green, we have Socrates. Down here, cut off from these pictures, we have Euclid and a number of the other teachers of the classical liberal arts. Now, this image should be for Christian parents interested in a classical education a source of questions, saying, okay, so this is the image, this is a representation by the artist Raphael, who lived in the time of the Renaissance. This is an image representing classical education. So is this image in agreement with the curriculum that we're actually providing our children with? And in Mother of Divine Grace School, the answer is going to be no. So for example, let's keep an eye out and look for Aristotle in this curriculum. Let's see where we find Aristotle in the Mother of Divine Grace curriculum. He, after all, is the center of this image. He is the one that St. Thomas Aquinas called the philosopher. Aristotle is the center of the classical Catholic curriculum. So let's take a look. The classical method is fundamental to Mother of Divine Grace School. It permeates every aspect of our program. And here we have an explanation. Okay, so this is the explanation of this curriculum. The end of education is wisdom. That's perfectly true. That's what philosophy and theology seek to study. Man desires to know, and that means we want to not only have facts, but reasons for the facts. True. We want to think about the highest things, the most noble, the most interesting in themselves. All true. There are steps in such an education. This is an assertion that needs to be proven. Even if we were to agree that there are steps, we would need to demonstrate what those steps are and how those steps are effectively taken. And by appealing to classical education, we should be able to point out where we find these steps and see them actually taken in Catholic educational history. She writes, one can't begin by studying the very, very highest things, obviously. One doesn't take out the Summa and begin a study of the nature of God with a second grader. Of course not. Why not? Because the student won't be able to understand, okay, this is all obvious chatter. Let's get to the real stuff. Liberal education, which we call classical education, is such an education. It begins in wonder and aims at wisdom. And here we have a clear statement. It involves the 7 liberal arts. Now, liberal education is the study of the 7 liberal arts. So now we should ask the question, how were these liberal arts studied in history? How were they studied in classical history? How were they studied in Catholic history? And does Mother of Divine Grace School actually teach these arts in a way similar to they were studied throughout Catholic history? The answer is going to be no. Liberal education or classical education, which I agree on, this is what classical education is, involves the 7 liberal arts. And notice the key word, arts, arts. But here's where we continue to go. It also includes the study of nature, the soul, ethics, and politics. That's true. That's philosophy. That's natural philosophy and moral philosophy, ethics and politics. The highest created objects, and finally, that to which all the others are ordered, theology, an understanding of the divine. I agree with all of that. Liberal education is Catholic education. Agree with that. For it has the same end. I agree with everything in this paragraph. That is all true. The education we give our children is intended to give them the beginning of the education of every person, every educated person in Western civilization, a classical liberal arts education. In such an education, the idea is to educate the man as man for whatever vocation he may pursue. Agree there. I teach this all the time. All of his faculties are used. He develops the power of his soul, his mind is strengthened and developed. All true. Though all men think, thinking can be done well or badly, and one can be taught to do it well. That's the art of reasoning. In large measure, the role of the teacher of... Now, here we begin to just make stuff up. In large measure, the role of the teacher of grade and high school children is this. There is no grade school. There is no high school in classical education. So here is where we start with this good historical information, but now as we start to come down to the ground, we run off the rails and start to do something that has nothing to do with that education that was just described. The teacher of grade and high school children. There's no such thing in classical education as grade school children. And you'll see that we start to run off the rails when we get practical. To do that, one must be familiar with how thinking takes place in the human person. The exposition I'm about to give comes from the De Anima, and it comes from a remarkably complex series of considerations. I'm summarizing the conclusions of that involved argument and won't do justice to the whole. Nonetheless, as I think every teacher should have a general understanding of the process, I'm going to give the summary as defective as it may be. Now, she just got done saying that you would never introduce a beginning student to the Summa Theologica. But in order to explain this methodology, we're now going to go into the De Anima of Aristotle, into a complex series of arguments, and we're going to provide a defective summary of those arguments in order to prove what's going to become the methodology of this curriculum. So we have a contradiction of what was stated to be the principle in the beginning. Why don't we just start by going back and looking at what Catholics actually taught children through history? Why do we need to go into this confusing, defective explanation of Aristotle's philosophy? This, again, is where we start to run off the rails. No one reading this page has any clue what Aristotle's De Anima teaches. And there's no reason for anyone to be dragged into that book in order to understand the 7 liberal arts, which we just saw named above. There's no reason for this distracting summary, as it were. One receives, let's just walk through it though. One receives the form of external objects by means of his 5 senses, obviously. He sees, hears, smells. We know what the 5 senses are. That information is received, 5 senses, okay. Aristotle says the existence of this faculty because he sees that though the eyes can tell that the object, yet the, okay, so this whole paragraph just rambles about the 5 senses. Just as the proper senses receive from external objects and common sense receive from proper senses, the imagination receives the integrated form from the common sense. But this power retains what it has received, unlike the senses, so we can produce at will images of the objects we've sensed. So we've talked about objects received by the senses and images. These are things that I've explained to petty school children. This is not complicated. The power of the image, so now we have this comparison to a slate. We don't need this long explanation. This integrated object is passed on via nerves, I suppose. This is all uncertain. And now we're mixing this with modern natural science theory and who knows what else. To what Aristotle calls the via cogitativa, or thinking power. The function of this power is to sort the objects into like kinds. This is simply the action of the mind called judgment. There is more to this process of thinking down here. These images retained in the imagination are sorted into like kinds. The agent intellect, the possible intellect, none of this is necessary to understand. So here's the conclusion. As educators, we must be concerned about perfecting whatever we can of every part of the process of thinking. Now, don't you think that Catholic educators of the past already knew this and incorporated this teaching into their textbooks? Don't you think that this has been done before by Catholic schoolmasters all through Catholic history? Why don't we simply go back to what they successfully did? Those saints and wise men who taught and educated the saints throughout history. Obviously, men have already done this. Men have already known what Aristotle teaches about learning, and they've already done it. Why don't we just go back and use the works that they produced? Men who were not confused and defective in their understanding like Mrs. Berquist, but men who are actually masters of these things, like Thomas Aquinas and the Jesuits. Why don't we just go back and use their teaching materials? We're going to go off the rails now. There's not much that one can do about the way common sense works. Okay, so let's ignore that. The training of the imagination, then, is one aspect of learning that our curriculum must take into account. Another consideration is that the student should do what is appropriate and natural to him at each point of learning. What is the period of learning? Where did we ever learn about any periods of learning? We just saw a few paragraphs above that there were 7 liberal arts. Don't you think the 7 liberal arts already take all of this into consideration and not only talk about it or summarize it, but actually turn it into detailed instruction, systematic instruction in those 7 liberal arts? Why are we rambling about philosophy and ideas as if this has never been done before? Because this is how we run off the rails into modern education. He should memorize, observe, and sequence at the grammatical stage. Where does this come from? We just talked about 7 liberal arts. There was no mention ever of any grammar stage. Grammar was the first liberal art. If we go back into history, the art of grammar is taught with a grammar textbook. The classical education we talked about before, which Mrs. Berquist herself named and described perfectly, has been abandoned, and we're now into this talk about a grammar stage. And we're going off the rails here. This strengthens and makes docile his imagination. What does this even mean? So that in the next stage of learning, the analytical stage, sometimes called the logical or the, who has ever called this a stage? Ever in the history of classical or Catholic education. This is invented by Dorothy Sayers. He will have the help of a trained imagination in summarizing, analyzing, and recognizing an argument, learning how to order material in an order of importance, whatever that means, and in constructing arguments. Yes, this is the art of reasoning. It's taught in Aristotle's Organon. It's the second art of the trivium, the art of reasoning. So why are we rambling about this as if we need to now invent a way to teach these things? It is essential to this education that when the student is capable of grasping and marshaling arguments, he should practice doing so. Okay. If he does, then the last stage, the rhetorical stage, which again, rhetoric is one of the 7 liberal arts. It's not a stage of learning. Then the rhetorical stage can be given to articulating those arguments elegantly in the service of the truly noble. At this stage, he will work on presentation of a position, polishing arguments, and putting together coherent thoughts. The student should, at these various stages, have the opportunity to consider much of the same material in a different light, based on his ability, interest, and level of formation. I want you to see that this whole section, from here to here, is all made up out of thin air. This idea here has nothing to do with the ideas that were expressed above. Yes, Aristotle did teach these ideas in De Anima, and that's why he wrote the Organon and the Rhetoric, to teach reasoning and rhetoric. The Jesuit schools published their own grammar textbooks to teach the art of grammar, and it was always taught in a number of other authoritative grammar texts throughout history. How have we gone off the rails here and started talking about grammar, logic, and rhetoric as 3 stages of learning? We've just abandoned the whole beginning of this page to go into this Dorothy Sayers world of stages of learning. The preceding explanation of our curriculum is a general one. There is another level of consideration where this general understanding is expressed in specific formation goals, and then further level. These are four kinds of formation. There are four kinds of formation goals involved at every level: the method, the content, the later formation to which the method is ordered, and the later knowledge to which the content is ordered. What in the world are we talking about by the end of this page? So yes, starting at the top of the page, we had a great picture of Aristotle and Plato and the authors of the classical liberal arts, which are actually down here out of the picture. We had a great explanation of classical education, saying that it's right here, this paragraph here, saying that there are 7 arts, naming the 7 arts, naming grammar, logic, and rhetoric as arts, 3 of the 7. But then by the end of this article, we're just lost in modern education talk, in Dorothy Sayers' fantasy land. If grammar, logic, and rhetoric are stages of learning, then what about arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy? Are they also stages of learning? What are we talking about? What we see is this, the big image of Aristotle and Plato and all of the philosophers, this clear explanation of the historical understanding of classical education is then abandoned by this bridge of this summary of Aristotle's teaching of the way of learning, so that we can actually get to this craziness at the end, which is just the Dorothy Sayers 3 stages of learning. This is how Laura Berquist misleads Catholic families. It starts with appearances of real history and real classical education, but then it subtly wanders with all kinds of fancy language and confusing talk about Aristotle and his teaching and these Latin phrases and this and that, all to get us to Dorothy Sayers and the 3 stages of learning. That's how Mrs. Berquist misleads Catholic families. You see a perfect example of it in this article. So, down at the bottom of this page, we're told that we can learn more about the method. So let's do that. Let's learn more about this method. And we have here a relatively short page. So this is supposedly the classical method that somehow is based on or related to the 7 liberal arts, which we saw named in that previous page. The method at the primary and grammatical levels. So we're back to stages and levels. The dialectical level. So this is just a further explanation of these Dorothy Sayers stages of learning. Really not very helpful. Well, let's go on and look at the content then, because we're not going to get anything from these methodology pages. It just rambles about the 3 stages of learning, which you could easily learn by reading Dorothy Sayers' essay, The Lost Tools of Learning, which is where all of this comes from. Content. Let's just ignore all of the babble and get down to the actual content. So let's look at the grammar curriculum, grades 3 through 5. We see a girl here at the grammatical stage, not studying the art of grammar, but reading a book about George Washington's world. So this is the grammatical stage. 3rd grade is the beginning of the next stage, because now primary stage has been added to this as another stage, but that we're just to accept that. In the classical curriculum. The classical curriculum. Doesn't that suggest that this exists somewhere in history? It's clearly saying that this is coming from the classical curriculum. And yet, we find the real source of it right here. Dorothy Sayers, in her essay, The Lost Tools of Learning, calls it the pole parrot stage. This education is not coming from Catholic history or from any classical educational history. This whole entire curriculum is nothing more than a program designed to follow the ideas of Dorothy Sayers in her essay, The Lost Tools of Learning. You can read that right here. It says it explicitly on this page. That's where this curriculum comes from. It does not come from Catholic history. It does not come from classical philosophy. It does not teach the 7 liberal arts, which Mrs. Berquist acknowledged being aware of on that previous page. While knowing those things, what she's actually doing is simply selling Dorothy Sayers's Lost Tools of Learning in Mother of Divine Grace School. This is stated explicitly on these pages. This is not my theory or opinion. She then quotes Dorothy Sayers, at this age, all of this is artificial, at this age, one readily memorizes the shapes and appearances of things. What in the world does that have to do with grammar? One likes to recite the number plates of cars. One rejoices in chanting rhymes. One enjoys the mere accumulation of things. What in the world are we talking about here? This is supposed to be the study of the 7 liberal arts: grammar, reasoning, rhetoric, arithmetic, music, geometry, astronomy. This is nothing but Dorothy Sayers' education, a Protestant philosophy of education, completely disconnected from the Catholic tradition, being sold to Catholic families under the name classical and Catholic education. So let's look at this curriculum. The 3rd grade syllabus. Now we're going to ignore the paragraphs and just look at the content. First, we have Religion 3. I guess they just give us samples, unfortunately. Here's the description. In religion, we use the Child Bible's history. Okay? And we study St. Joseph's Baltimore Catechism number 1. That's great. In mathematics, we use Abeka, a Protestant publisher. We use Arithmetic 3 by Abeka to teach mathematical skills, including memorization. Now, let me ask you this. What does this have to do with the classical liberal arts? What does this have to do with the classical liberal arts? In language arts, we study primary language lessons. Let me ask you this. If we go back to the Ratio Studiorum of the Jesuits in the 1600s, do you think that they started language arts? Where are the language arts in the classical liberal arts? The language arts are grammar, reasoning, and rhetoric. We should be studying the art of grammar. Why are we not studying the art of grammar as it was taught to children by Catholics in history? Why are we using this book? In spelling and phonics, again, why are we using the Writing Road to Reading when we know that Catholics have taught these subjects all through history? In poetry, we use the harp and laurel wreath in science. What is science in the classical Catholic curriculum? What in the world is science? And why are we using a textbook published by a Protestant publisher, Abeka? You're telling us that there is no classical Catholic source for the study of the natural world? Catholics never studied the natural world using Catholic sources? And Abeka, a Protestant homeschool publisher, is the only available source of Catholic knowledge of the natural world? We then have stories of famous Americans. We then have geography. We then have Latin and Greek roots. It says we begin to study Latin and Greek. In art, we use third grade art. In music, we use Let's Learn Music. My question is, what does this have to do with classical Catholic education? Where in history was any such curriculum ever studied by Catholic children? Rather, how is this not simply a public school curriculum? A curriculum, I can tell you, my wife worked in a Protestant elementary school. This is what she taught in her Protestant elementary school. They used Abeka in the Protestant private school. So are you telling me that my wife, when she was teaching second grade in a Protestant private school, that she was giving those children a classical Catholic education? Because she certainly didn't think she was. This is not classical education. This is not Catholic education. This has nothing to do with classical or Catholic education. What this is a big box of books for sale. That's what this is. It's a big box of books for sale that serves a modern curriculum and actually has nothing to do with the classical Catholic curriculum, which Mrs. Berquist proved that she's aware of in the curriculum page where she explained what the 7 classical liberal arts were and what the different divisions of philosophy were. She named on the curriculum page the curriculum of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, which is explicitly taught in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Here, in Mother of Divine Grace School, what these children are doing has nothing to do with that curriculum. She's simply following a model presented by a Protestant author, Dorothy Sayers, pulling Protestant textbooks that happen to be in print and is throwing together this hodgepodge of books and resources to serve what looks like a public school grade level curriculum, and claiming that she's doing this to follow some principles that were taught in Aristotle's work on the soul. This is nothing other than a modern grade level study program. As I said, my wife used these same books teaching second grade in a Protestant private school. But this is being sold as Catholic education, and worse, it's being sold as classical education when there could be nothing more modern than this. Go visit a Protestant private school and you'll likely find this exact curriculum there. How then is it classical or Catholic? Let's go and look at the dialectic stage. We have a picture of a boy playing a violin. What is this curriculum based on? Well, here we have it in the first sentence. In the Lost Tools of Learning, Miss Dorothy Sayers says. Now, Does this appear to be a curriculum that's trying its best to provide parents with a classical Catholic education? Why in the world would a Catholic study program depend on quotes from a Protestant speech to lay out its curriculum and explain what's going on? Again, this is nothing other than an attempt to Catholicize the Protestant classical education movement. Dorothy Sayers was a Protestant. Her ideas were Protestant. She was made known by Doug Wilson, who took her ideas and launched the Protestant classical education movement. All that this is an attempt to sell that program to Catholic families. We're even using Protestant books. We're simply packaging books and selling them because Dorothy Sayers gave us a good framework to organize a book selling business. This is not a classical Catholic curriculum. This is not a classical Catholic education. So let's look at what this says. Since the student is now interested in arguments, capitalize on his natural inclinations. Let him talk about reasoning. I have no idea what that means. The emphasis in each subject, notice we're not studying the art of reasoning, we're studying math and science and history, and we're calling this a stage of learning. It is a beginning of the study of logic, not a formal study, as one will do in Aristotle's prior and posterior analytics, but be preparing for that study. So, how would a student not study Aristotle's works on reasoning if he is in the reasoning stage of his education? If the reasoning stage is real, wouldn't that be the appropriate time to study Aristotle's work on reasoning, which again, Mrs. Berquist shows that she's aware of, but she's not following Aristotle, she's following Dorothy Sayers. She's not teaching the art of reasoning, she's teaching the reasoning or dialectic stage of learning from Dorothy Sayers. If you actually want your children to learn the art of reasoning, they should study Aristotle's books on the art of reasoning rather than this nonsense labeled the dialectical stage, which is just pure fiction. So let's go down a little. Let's look at a ninth grade. So we're talking about a kid who's 14, 15 years old in a normal school model. So this would be the end of the quote unquote dialectic or reasoning stage. Here's our ninth grade curriculum. We have religion, algebra, grammar being studied in the dialectical stage. We're studying grammar. Earth science is apparently part of the dialectical stage curriculum. Then we have American history, and we have Latin 1. First year Latin is being studied in ninth grade. How many children do you believe in the history of the Catholic world began studying Latin grammar in ninth grade? How many children in the history of Catholic education Do you believe we're studying algebra and grammar and earth science in ninth grade? Let me ask you this. What makes this a classical Catholic education? How is this not just a modern education? Why is grammar being studied in the dialectic stage? Wouldn't it seem that grammar would be studied in the grammar stage? And why is reasoning not being studied in the reasoning stage? Wouldn't one think that we would study the art of reasoning in the reasoning stage? How do you parents fall for this stuff, honestly? How do you fall for this stuff? How can you let someone just blow smoke in your eyes and rip you off like this? This is not classical education. This is not Catholic education. This is modern public school education. How can you fall for this? 12th grade, let's look over here. We have something called Catholic doctrine. Advanced mathematics. Notice, we've never looked at the art of arithmetic in the 7 liberal arts. Here we have geometry. Is this the classical liberal art of geometry, or is this just a modern geometry class? We have natural science. What happened to natural philosophy? What happened to the philosophy of nature that St. Thomas Aquinas studied and taught? Or Pliny's natural history? Or Aristotle's history of animals? Or Theophrastus's history of plants? How have we moved from the study of natural philosophy, which is what was taught in classical education, to natural science, biology, earth science? How does this relate in any way to classical Catholic education? Senior year, 12th grade, we study Latin 2, another book, British literature, American government, advanced mathematics, and a religion course called Catholic Doctrine. Isn't this the rhetoric stage of learning? We don't study the art of rhetoric in the rhetoric stage? Why don't we study the art of rhetoric? We still haven't studied the art of reasoning yet, and we're just barely studying the art of grammar. We've never studied the art of arithmetic or music. I'm not sure that the 10th grade geometry class is actually the study of the art of geometry from Euclid. And we've certainly not gotten into any classical astronomy. So here's my question. What was the point of commenting on the 7 classical liberal arts on the curriculum page when that is never, ever taught in this curriculum? Never taught. So we would have a student here, 12th grade, we would have a student who is 18 years old, who is a legal adult, who has never learned the art of grammar or reasoning or rhetoric or arithmetic or geometry or music or astronomy, has still not studied ethics and philosophy, has not studied natural philosophy, but instead has been introduced to modern high school science, has not been introduced to metaphysics, has not learned to study the scriptures as he ought through daily scripture studies, has likely not studied the Summa Theologica, which St. Thomas says is intended for beginners in theology, and instead has this curriculum on the screen as his preparation for adult life with a classical Catholic education. Do you believe that that curriculum you're looking at there on your screen is a classical Catholic education that follows the methodology of Aristotle, St. Thomas, Cicero, and the other wise men and saints from history? Do you think that this is a classical Catholic education? Or does it look very much like a modern secular education with some religion literally added on top? This is a minimum standards education aimed at satisfying modern secular public school requirements. This is not a classical Catholic education. Now, as a comparison, let's quickly look at the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Here on the page, I have an image of the 7 classical liberal arts, and here sitting in the midst of the page is Lady Wisdom, or philosophy herself. There are 7 classical liberal arts, just as Mrs. Berquist said on their curriculum page. But here's the difference. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we study the art of grammar, the art of reasoning, the art of rhetoric, and then we go on to study the art of arithmetic, the art of geometry, the art of music, and the art of astronomy. Remember Mrs. Berquist mentioned ethics, natural philosophy? Well, we go on to study philosophy, and what do we study? Classical ethics, classical physics or natural philosophy, and classical metaphysics. As for theology, the Church teaches us that theology divides into 2 separate streams: divine revelation contained in sacred scripture, and sacred tradition, which is studied through the catechisms and teachings of the doctors of the Church. The classical Catholic curriculum, which is illustrated in these ancient pictures that everyone loves to share and then ignore once it's time to start selling books, is literally taught in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. We don't make excuses for abandoning this and selling Protestant books instead. We explain what the classical Catholic curriculum is. We can show you in history what Catholic schools taught, and then we restore that true classical Catholic curriculum for our students in their years of education. We don't send children off as adults into the world hoping that they go and learn reasoning someplace else, because they won't. And they certainly shouldn't have to go to a school like Thomas Aquinas College and pay $30,000 a year to read a book that they should have read when they were 12 and 13 years old. And when they try to tell you that it's impossible for students to understand these things, I can tell you that they're wrong. They're wrong. Grammar is the first art of the trivium. It's studied by young children, and it's continually studied all through life because there are grammars for different languages. There's not just one stage of grammar. That makes no sense. Grammar is an art. If you're 40 years old and you'd like to learn Greek, you need to study the art of grammar. You're not in any certain stage of learning. Grammar is an art, and the art needs to be studied for any language. The art of reasoning is contained in one set of books, Aristotle's Organon. If you want to learn the art of reasoning, it has nothing to do with your age or public school grade level. It has to do with studying a specific book or set of books. If you want to learn the art of rhetoric, you don't suddenly transform like a caterpillar into a butterfly at a certain point, and all of a sudden you're now in the rhetoric stage. You need to study the art of rhetoric, which is contained in Aristotle's book, The Art of Rhetoric. These things aren't complicated. This is very explicit and simple. In this medieval monastery picture, they clearly understood what the 7 liberal arts were. There's no 3 stages of learning. That idea was invented by Dorothy Sayers. And when we look at Mother of Divine Grace, simply quoting Dorothy Sayers to explain their curriculum, we have to wonder if there's so much Catholic information, textbooks, resources available, why in the world is Mother of Divine Grace School teaching with Protestant textbooks and basing their curriculum on a Protestant lecture given in the 1900s? So if you're to choose between Mother of Divine Grace and Classical Liberal Arts Academy, to honestly answer the question, which of these is the classical Catholic curriculum? There's no way that you can say that Mother of Divine Grace is the classical Catholic curriculum. Mother of Divine Grace is simply a Catholic version of the Dorothy Sayers program. It's the same program taught in Protestant classical homeschool programs. You can go look at Veritas Press, you can go look at Canon Press, and you'll find the same exact layout of the program in Protestant circles because it's a Protestant idea. Laura Berquist has simply taken that Protestant idea and sold it to ignorant and unquestioning Catholic homeschool families. If you want to give your children, and I'm not sure that anyone actually does, but if you do want to give your children a true classical Catholic education, the education that was studied and taught and recommended by the philosophers and saints of real history, the only place you can find that is in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I hope that's a persuasive presentation of the truth about Mother of Divine Grace School. I hope that Catholic parents don't continue to allow themselves to be deceived by these misleading and confusing explanations of things like Aristotle's theory of learning, which is just a bunch of smoke and mirrors to get you from the true classical curriculum, which is known, into some crazy fictional world of stages of learning. If you'd like to learn more, visit me in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I'd be happy to provide you with a free homeschool consultation where we can talk about your circumstances, your children, your goals, and how they can be served by the real classical Catholic curriculum. I'm happy to set you up with free student pages, allow you to get started and see how things work with free courses, and take your time and learn. I've also published a book, a collection of lessons that I've written in the past that explains the true history and principles of real classical Catholic education. It's called Understanding Classical Catholic Education. You can download a free copy on the Classical Liberal Arts Academy website. I know that this presentation is clear and persuasive. I hope that you find it helpful. And if you're seeking for your children a true classical Catholic education, I hope you don't allow yourself to pretend that one is found at Mother of Divine Grace School. If you'd like a real classical Catholic education, it's available affordably in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. God bless your studies.